I'm just laying my cards on the table here. I'm a secular liberal naturalist, and I'm going to try and just defend secular liberal naturalism against, in this way, dialectically, against Fiona's theistic, expansive naturalism. But of course, Fiona's position, expansive, where she comes from at least, expansive naturalism and liberal naturalism are both inspired by John McDowell. So I want to go back to look at some of John McDowell to see how to read him, because I think there's issues there. But just to say about Fiona Ellis, in her 214 book, argues for a theistic version of expansive naturalism that, it seems to me, ultimately undermines the distinction between naturalism and supernaturalism, such that, and this is a quote, naturalism is no longer a distinct ism, since it can accommodate everything, most notably a commitment to God with an irreducibly supernatural dimension. And so I think it's important, therefore, to defend secular liberal naturalism, non-theistic, and the legitimacy of naturalism as a distinctive category, a distinctive ism that is an anti-supernaturalism. And I think, in fact, some of Fiona's own writings lend support to that. And so I don't agree that naturalism is an all-inclusive category. And I think the exclusion of the supernatural still matters to contemporary thinking. But there's a lot to say, but I know there's not much time. So in this talk, I'm only going to attempt to undermine Fiona's argument for a theistic expansive naturalism based on an analogy she sees between evaluative expansion, that is to say you start with a narrow scientific image of the world and you expand it out to include moral value, and a theistic expansion of the concept of nature where you add in a commitment to the Christian God. And I certainly want to resist any claim that for a liberal naturalist or an expansive naturalist, as she calls it, to not make the theistic move is to make any kind of error. I think there is no error, and I think it's totally reasonable to be a secular liberal naturalist. But I also want to, you'll see, I wanted to put some distance between expansive and liberal naturalism, and this comes out from something Giuseppina said this morning, one of her comments about expansion. Anyway, what do we have in common? The common ground that expansive naturalism has and liberal naturalism has is just that we both reject the idea that the world is nothing but the scientific image of the world, whether that's conceived as narrowly or broadly, whether you include the human sciences or not. We both think that it's wrong to think that there's only scientific forms of knowledge or understanding of the successful sciences. So again, we're allowing that the world contains non-scientific entities like moral values, persons, artworks, and non-scientific knowledge and understanding of such things. So that's all common ground. So this is really a kind of an in-house disagreement amongst friends. But let me go back to McDowell. So McDowell is famous for rejecting dogmatic scientism or excessive science worship within scientific naturalism. So all of us agree, I agree with McDowell, and I think Fiona does too, that science deserves respect but not worship. And part of that depends on the idea that nature is a wider category than that of the scientific image. So that's completely common ground. But what Ellis sees in McDowell is what she calls expansive naturalism, which begins with the restrictive scientific image of the world and then expands its ontology by adding, that's a word she uses, or postulating moral value, something sui generis, irreducible to scientific categories. And the key move of the expansive naturalist is this expansion of the realm of nature, which proposes a sort of a wider ontology. So the expansive naturalist is seen as engaging in the metaphysics of a thing called ontology, theory of being, and expanding out into wider and wider accounts until, in the end, naturalism just doesn't hold any water. I mean, because God has supernatural dimension, and therefore the whole notion of naturalism collapses. Because, as I understand naturalism, it means anti-supernaturalism. So if it includes the category of the supernatural, you just don't have a genuine naturalism anymore. So that's what I think is the problem. So in her view, in Ellis's view, you start with this expansive naturalism, which is the one that includes moral values, but doesn't include theism, because it's rejecting supernaturalism. So that's McDowell's view. It's also close to the liberal naturalist view, which again, I would certainly accept that there are moral values or reasons, but not accept anything supernatural into that position. And it seems to me important to say that part of the point of naturalism in the history of thought was precisely to separate philosophy from theology, given the long history of their interrelationship. So that part of the point of being a naturalist was that. And I think I don't understand why, if you're a theist, you don't just say, I'm a non-naturalist. I mean, why not just embrace... I guess I don't really fully understand that. I don't see why you don't just say, I'm a non... Paul Franks, for instance, a friend of mine, just says, I'm a non-naturalist. I believe in God, and that's inconsistent with naturalism. But anyway, the idea is, given the logic of expansive naturalism, Ellis exploits the thought that we've already made the move to include values, so what's stopping the issue of God being included as well? We've already got the category of non-supernatural entities and non-scientific entities and non-scientific understanding. So why not go further? So she argues, that there's an analogy then between what she calls evaluative expansion and theistic expansion. The analogy isn't super tight because in the case of God, God's not strictly the same as moral value, of course. God is not fully intelligible to us for a start. And God has a curious relation to nature that's very complicated, and we heard some of it this morning in the discussion between John and Fiona. God seems to be not wholly locatable, even in the expanded natural realm, the realm that McDowell calls second nature, even if God is conceived as intimately related to nature as its source. So that's, Fiona stresses the idea that God is the creator of nature and of moral value. But again, it's a complicated story about how God relates to nature, which is quite different from the case of value. Now, I think I want to go back to McDowell's own writings here to see whether we can't distinguish the way Fiona reads it from another way to read it. So she reads McDowell as an expansive naturalist understood in these metaphysical terms, as somebody who starts with a scientific image and then adds additional ontology. And she thinks, well, why stop short of theistic commitments? And this is just about McDowell, reading McDowell. McDowell is explicitly a metaphysical quietist. He neither affirms nor denies metaphysical theses. So he certainly is not doing ontology as that's typically understood. And I think it's consistent with his position that what he calls liberal naturalism is just not a metaphysical doctrine at all. It shouldn't be thought to be such. So in that way, it's quite different from the way that Fiona's conceiving what she calls expansive naturalism. Liberal naturalism, what's called that, is a dialectical move aimed at resisting scientific naturalism, whilst retaining the right to the notion of naturalism as anti-supernaturalism. And here's a remark that, again, of McDowell's that is just worth looking at. He says, what nature means at the root of naturalism is, in, say, relaxed naturalism or liberal naturalism, is not supernatural, not occult, not magical. And there is no need for me to take a stand on whether everything is natural in that sense, thereby, among other things, giving needless offence to people who think respect for modern science is compatible with a kind of religious belief that preserves the room for the supernatural. Now, Ellis writes this as an interpretation. She says, quote, so McDowell is prepared to allow that there are phenomena which are not natural in the more liberal, non-scientific sense of that term, and that these phenomena count as supernatural. And it's this reading, which is supposed to give an opening for the supernatural in the liberal naturalist position, that Ellis wants to exploit by arguing that supernaturalism involving reality can be made good sense of in theistic terms. But I think that's not what McDowell means when she takes it that way. Rather, as I've said, his relaxed or liberal naturalism is non-doctrinal. And McDowell simply does not need to take a stand on whether everything is natural in the sense of anti-supernatural, because he isn't in the business of exploring the nature, scope and limits of the supernatural. So I think that's exactly why he doesn't take it the way that she does. So as I see it, and this is important also for the way Mario and I may or may not be diverging, is that liberal naturalism is not a doctrine. So it seems to me that it's more like a philosophical platform, and I think it's a non-metaphysical platform or a non-doctrinal platform that can be combined together with a whole plurality of different doctrinal commitments. It's really a reorientation of philosophy, an opening up of a conceptual space that was overlooked or avoided in the history of philosophy due to the grip of a false dualism. That's the dualism between seeing things in terms of scientism or supernaturalism. And so in that way, it's to open up a space between those, but it doesn't tell you to think of that space in any specific way, just to be anti-supernatural about it. So the way I think of liberal naturalism, it's not an ontology, but it's better be conceived of as a recovery of the manifest image, what Wittgenstein calls the everyday, which metaphysics, especially modern scientific metaphysics, tended to denigrate or overlook. So I think that's the way I see it. So taking the case of moral value, I don't know how much time I've got. Okay. So Fiona focuses on the case of moral value, so I just want to look at that case. So recall that the expansive naturalist sees moral value as an expansion of the ontology of the sciences, as if this ontology included no such thing, as if the sciences didn't include moral value. But on the liberal naturalist conception, I think Ellis is simply presupposing the legitimacy of the misguided fact-value dualism within the sciences, taking seriously the scientific naturalist's own claim that the sciences are value-free. But I want to argue that, in fact, the sciences are up to their necks in values, including moral values. So part of the point of liberal naturalism is to recover the manifest image and then to study or explore its normative topography. That's the idea of it. So a problem with the idea that there's any basic clash between the scientific and manifest images of the world is that it focuses all attention on what we might call the theoretical scientific image. That's to say, the posits of the successful sciences. And this goes back to something Charles said this morning. It forgets that science is a set of practices, and that these practices presuppose the reality of persons, so scientists, and laboratories and experiments and linguistic communication. Science presupposes linguistic communication. It also presupposes the cognitive values of coherence, reasonableness, Occam's razor, simplicity, and the moral political values of good inquiry, which is things like justice to the other inquirers, toleration of divergent opinions, equal respect for fellow inquirers. All of that's just presupposed if you think science is a practice rather than just a mere theoretical set of posits. So that's one of the things that constantly is made a mistake of in philosophy. And I would add, apart from the cognitive, moral and political values science presupposes, science itself is a commitment to the value of objectivity. So there's a huge history of this, the book by Daston and Gallison, detailing the way science has, over time, built a notion of objectivity by constantly excluding different forms of subjectivity from its notions of measurement and verification and re-identification is very important. So liberal naturalism, it seems to me, involves the possibility of rethinking the scientific image and showing that the manifest image is already implicit in it. That the whole debate about there being a placement problem, a naturalist placement problem, and how do we find room in the natural world for values and reason, is all just misconceived. It's a total misconception. And so the important task of the liberal naturalist is not to expand nature from a restrictive scientific value-free core. It's to reject the scientific naturalist's way of conceiving the scientific image. We've got to remind the scientific naturalist that science is a set of practices which presuppose values, including moral values. So we're uncovering values that were always already there. And that stands in stark contrast, it seems to me, to the expansive naturalist idea that values must be added onto a value-free scientific image. And that shows, again, this shows how important what Wittgenstein called pictures of a conceptual landscape are, because I think these are two quite different pictures. So, again, I don't know how am I going for time?
You have 5
5 minutes,
minutes.
okay. So from a liberal naturalist perspective, moral values were just falsely denied or overlooked from the point of view of the blinkered scientific metaphysics of the scientific naturalist. And so I want to say, in order to properly describe the human form of life, including our scientific inquiries, we must make reference to moral values. So this is where I agree with Akil's paper, and I think also his idea that we have to talk about values in the full normative sense and not in some reduced individualistic sense. So it seems to me values, moral values, are then indispensable to a proper account of the human. And this is where I disagree with the theistic point of view, because I just don't think the same can be said for God as can be, I just said, for moral value. I do not see that a proper description of the human form of life, our experiences, our moral relations to others, and so forth, must make reference to God. A belief in God as the source of nature and morality is optional, in a way that belief in moral values is not. Now, I know John has argued that if we're to understand the authority and normativity, or the normative authority of moral values, we need to invoke God. But I think equally I would want to go the direction Akil was going and say that some of that distance from the individual perspective can be gained by tradition and society, and there must be some complicated story to tell about that I can't tell. But I think I would be inclined to go that way, to try to capture the sense of transcendence rather than think that you need to invoke a theistic account to do that. But I certainly see the pressure to invoke something. And I want to say that belief in God's optional, and I think it's not true that the only reason to reject God is some sort of scientism, which is one of the things that I think in Fiona's book comes across, is the thought that the reason people object to God is just scientistic. I want to say, no, I'm not scientistic, I'm a liberal naturalist, but I also want to say it's possible to be secular, and it's reasonable to be secular. It's not some sort of intellectual error or mistake. On the other hand, I think, despite the fact that Fiona's argument from analogy doesn't go through, it seems to me, I still think she achieves her main aim. So her main aim, she says, is to persuade the expansive naturalist, and I think she'd also include us, the liberal naturalist, that it's intellectually respectable to believe in God. I think she does achieve this aim, and I think she achieves it very well because she uses other grounds, ones apart from her main argument. So she says, if someone interprets their religious experiences, as people call them, as evidence of God, or if they take their moral interactions with others as an expression of a relation to God, as Levinas does, or if they think the natural world has its source in God, as Fiona does, that's not an intellectual error. I don't see that as any intellectual error, but I do think those ways of thinking are optional. I don't share them, but I think someone who does think that way, it's perfectly intellectually respectable. A final thing I want to say is liberal naturalism is not scientistic. That's to say, it doesn't limit its conception of nature to the scientific image. It allows for non-scientific understanding and knowledge. But I think it's important to see that it does share with science a methodological commitment to anti-supernaturalism. Anything that is not sufficiently related to the empirical realm is not acceptable. And I think this idea of what's not sufficiently related to the empirical realm, I don't have a story about that in general, but I think it's worked out on a case-by-case basis, what that comes to. And I think it's still important. And I think that Fiona herself recognises this category because she talks in her book about cosmic excess, she talks about metaphysical fancy, and those are all things that one might include in that category. And moreover, she writes that occult and magical forces were supposed to be operative in nature according to pre-scientific superstition. And all I would add to that, which I think is right, is that such thinking continues to exist in our age of science. So in a Associated Press poll from 2011, 77% of Americans surveyed claimed to believe in angels, understood as ethereal beings who can intervene in the natural world. That's to say, for instance, to cure illness. So there's this idea of being touched by an angel, and 77% of Americans surveyed believed in that. And I think that's where I'll end up. Thanks.